Hello and welcome to Pricing College with your hosts Aidan Campbell
and Joanna Wells.
In today's episode, we want to talk about one of those more dark arts style aspects of pricing that isn't purely cost plus pricing or pricing strategy, but the topic of anchoring.
Yes, anchoring. It's a concept that sits within the area of behavioural economics, which is fundamentally largely to do with psychology and behavioural psychology. And the founding father of behavioural economics is a guy called Daniel Kahneman. And he was the first person to question the economic theory of people buying logically, rationally, and actually suggested that people buy emotionally, irrationally. And this is where, that concept of anchoring really derives.
And I think our listeners, nearly everyone will be aware of being influenced to some extent, when they're out shopping. A classic example is you go into a clothes retailer to buy some new clothes and you see 30% sale discount signs. And somewhere in your mind, you think, oh, this must be a great deal because I'm getting it lower than potentially even an artificially high anchored price. So what's happened here is you've been anchored to that higher price. And with that, then you think you're getting a great price now.
See, pricing is a good way to anchor people and to help them understand what value actually is. Because people find it very difficult to think about value. It's an abstract term, so they need it to be sort of like framed for them. It needs to be anchored and positioned correctly for them to understand what's good, what's not so good.
Yeah, and I think this topic's been covered in a couple of very good and easy reading books. A couple by Cialdini, Influence, I think, was one where he covered it, and also the book Priceless by William Poundstone, both of which give a number of examples of this topic. One thing that struck me was when you ask people, how tall a mountain is or a hill is, often they can't really give it, they're often not aware unless they see it in reference to something else. And in many regards, pricing similar. It's the price compared to another price.
So I suppose, in terms of, simple cost plus pricing, we were thinking about that earlier, and how people set prices on costs. If you look at that in terms of anchoring, you can see by setting prices on costs, you're actually lowering your potential to get a higher price because it's gravitating and anchoring everyone to cost. And you're not really thinking about willingness to pay, how customers perceive value, and really not really testing that price ceiling.
Yeah, I think that you can even anchor yourself in a negative way. You can even anchor your own sales team. If you constantly go on about cost, there is a tendency for people to push it down to that cost. They will see it as the cost. That's the number that will be anchored in their mind as well. Another classic example, and some of these things can be a little bit hard to believe unless you saw the statistical evidence. The classic example of buying or selling a used car. All the evidence suggests that if you want to sell it at a high price, you should, as the seller, you should just quote, get in there first and quote a high price. Then you will anchor the purchaser to a higher price for the later negotiation.
Well, there's another reason why people didn't, like estate agents, for instance, they were quite reluctant in the past to actually use auctions because it had a tendency to pull things down. But in a boom, however, they found that an auction can actually increase the price point because people are anchoring themselves by a dream of the best house in the lovely suburb. So in a downturn, it's probably not good to do an auction. In a boom time, it's probably a good option to use the auction as a way to sell houses.
Yeah, it's very often it's the way the question is presented to people, not just necessarily pricing, but you can use this anchoring concept in many regards. You'll see it in things such as referendums in countries or the way questions are asked in political questions. The governments are often very concerned about framing the question in a certain manner because that is statistically proven to influence the outcome. Even though the question is logically the same, the answer you get can be very different.
Yeah, and in Cialdini's book, there's an interesting study about how the concept of anchoring, not just applying to prices and numbers, but also applying to ideas. And in this study, they wanted to see if the presentation of an exam influenced people's results, in particular women's results. And they found that having a different format, a more positive gender format, actually increased marks for women by 10 to 20%. So literally how they framed the study, the exam, really did make people actually perform better, women perform better in exams.
I think we're going to wrap it up quite shortly. I think what we covered today, it really indicates that pricing and the pricing profession is much more than just numbers on a spreadsheet. There's a science, but there's also an art to it, and where that line is drawn, who really knows? But there's certainly room for people with very, very talents in this profession, and hopefully, different people find this podcast interesting.
Yeah. So when you think about, what does customer focused pricing mean? You really are moving into, more psychology, behavioural economics. You are looking at finance and maths, but you're looking at things in its entirety. The market isn't easy to understand. People aren't easy to understand, but you have to try and find those different measures to gauge and improve your price setting.
Okay, so I think we'll leave it there. I just say thank you and have a good weekend.
Yeah, thanks a lot.